Welcome to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also syndicated on WHIV New Orleans. I'm your host, Brian Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. For the full hour on this episode, we are joined by Gloria La Riva, who's the 2016 presidential candidate for the Party for Socialism and Liberation, also a longtime activist, political organizer of various stripes, and the coordinator of the Cuba-Venezuela Solidarity Committee. She just finished up a nationwide speaking tour about her experiences in Venezuela this past year. So thank you very much, Gloria, for coming on once again.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate the invitation.
Always glad to have you on. Can we start with, I guess, a little bit with the trip itself, kind of how it came to be, the general rundown of kind of what you were able to see during your time in Venezuela?
Sure. Being in Venezuela from February 12 to March 12 this year, in the middle of a very intense aggression of the United States against the country and the challenges that the government is facing, along with the people, with the U.S. sanctions, I saw so many things there that discounted the U.S. media lies of the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, even National Public Radio, that, of course, I needed to share this. It's not just for my personal knowledge or experience. And therefore, reporting for Liberation News, I was able to visit 40 cities and multiple venues in those cities to relate what I have seen, including with video that I have taped and edited.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot there. And for those of you who are interested, I posted one of your speeches from San Antonio on our website, on our Spreaker. So we'll try to link to that if people kind of want to hear more about that. One of the kind of bludgeons that's often used against commentators is, oh, well, you think you know this or that country. Why don't you try going to that country? Why don't you try living in that country, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that's sort of a non-starter because I have right now $8 in my bank account. So unless you have kind of that luxury of being able to travel, in which case you're getting a different perspective anyway, that's not really an option. So the other thing that for people who are able to go to somewhere like Venezuela and see it for themselves, the other thing that is always said at that point is, oh, well, you're being shown what the government wants you to see. So maybe you can talk a little bit about kind of your experiences, because first of all, I think that line of reasoning is very insulting for the person who is there. It basically makes the claim that they themselves cannot determine what is and what is not something that the government wants them to see, et cetera. And yeah, it never really gets to the full story. So can you maybe talk more about, how you feel you were able to see really as much of the country as you would like?
Yes. First, in the United States media and other Western press of the world, the U.S. media, at least during this year, has intensely covered the issue of Venezuela in an extremely slanted way to justify U.S. sanctions, creating a picture of a humanitarian crisis, and therefore the U.S. must do everything they can to intervene. So there are two versions to the story of Venezuela. There's that of the U.S. government and the 1% of the country, those who used to rule without any limitations in the country before Hugo Chavez became president 20 years ago, in 1999. The country used to be ruled by two parties, very similar to Democrats and Republicans, who for 40 years had a pact of sharing their power from 1958 to 1998. This is a country that has enormous resources in natural wealth. That is, the largest resources of oil in the world, the largest resources of gold.
Oh, wow.
And nickel ore. And they say diamonds. It's an extremely wealthy country, but the population was a vast majority who were in poverty, because U.S., British, French, Dutch oil companies enjoyed super profits. And then, of course, a certain percentage to the 1%, the Venezuelan elite. So Hugo Chavez really changed that whole dynamics when he became president, a new constitution came in with the resources being of the people, as the Constitution says, and the policies that emanated from that perspective, that the people must enjoy the wealth that they create themselves in the country of Venezuela. Of course, the Chavez government also shared much of that wealth with the world. Example in the U.S., giving hundreds of millions of gallons of heating oil to communities that would suffer otherwise without having heating oil in the winter. But to get back to this, so if you believe that the U.S. oil companies should be able to continue enriching themselves and that the population should be poor, well, you're going to support the U.S. media view because they want to overthrow the president of Nicolas Maduro. And they tried to overthrow Hugo Chavez. If you are of those who believe that the wealth should be used to create the housing, as they've built 2.6 million homes at a very symbolic price, beautiful homes, to the population, people who need housing, housing built for housing's need, for the people's need and not for profit. If you believe that education should be free, as dozens of universities have been built in 20 years for free education, and if you believe that healthcare should be free, that is being provided by 24,000 Cuban medical doctors right now in Venezuela in exchange for Cuba getting oil from Venezuela, a fair exchange. If you believe in all this benefit for the people, then you're going to accept the view and position that a president, Nicolas Maduro, who was elected last year by those masses, by 67.8% of the population, which supports that pro-people policy. That's the thing. It's a class struggle. Are you for the rich or for you for the poor? Are you for the rich or are you for the working class? And that's what I was reporting to counter the U.S. pro-oil company, pro-Pentagon perspective.
For so long, Venezuela was propped up by the U.S. as what they called a quote-unquote model democracy, I think was the term they used. We understand this to be pretty ridiculous today, but essentially, as you were saying, there were kind of two major political parties that essentially shared power, and so this was their quote-unquote alternative to kind of the more open military dictatorships of, say, Chile, for instance, or Brazil or Colombia, was to kind of show that actually capitalism can't have democracy where it was not having democracy anywhere else. But this that democracy, again, the kind of plurality of the parties, in so many ways was a farce leading up to the Caracazo, where thousands were essentially machine gunned in the streets of Caracas. The Caracazo meaning like essentially the thing in Caracas, the explosion in Caracas. And so ever since then, we can understand that Venezuela has continued to improve the standards of living in so many really kind of drastic ways that are never talked about, both under Chavez and even as the U.S. sanctions have intensified. The Venezuelan government still continues to build such amazing programs that are providing not only food security. You see the actual even as you hear the quote unquote reports of people starving in the street or whatnot, the actual Venezuelan food security situation has been better under any point in Maduro, under Maduro or Chavez, under the PSUV, since the Bolivarian Revolution. Food security and housing security today is still so much better than it was at any point pre-Chavez during the kind of period of the Caracazo and whatnot. So one of the programs I think we keep hearing about, and one of the ones that was last sanctioned by the Trump administration despicably, was the CLAP program. So can you maybe talk about what the CLAP program does, so the mechanisms, because on one hand, it's a food distribution system, and then on the other, it's sort of cultivating, from my understanding, kind of food independence as well, and like really trying to cultivate kind of local food markets in kind of new and interesting ways. Were you able to see much of that when you were there?
Yeah, first I'd like to say that you referred to the Caracazo, and I'd like to say a little bit of what it was. It was the uprising. It was a rebellion by people in the town of Caracas, the capital, but also around the country, when the U.S. supported President Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1989, 9 years before Chavez was elected. In 1989, he raised suddenly the prices of food, gasoline, other essential items in a time when the poverty was so great. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank had been demanding great social service and employment cutbacks in order for the government to pay the debt to the banks. So when these prices went up, the people exploded in rebellion, took food from the stores, and that's when they were machine gunned by the army and the police. And at accounts of up to 3,000 people, maybe even more, were murdered for a righteous rebellion. That is when Hugo Chavez, as a young soldier in the army, was already training some men with him to say, we got to fight for social justice. 3 years after the Caracazo, he takes on the now dictator. He ends up in prison, but he was freed 2 years later by popular demand of the people who saw him as a hero for standing up for them. And that's how he got elected. A man who didn't belong to the traditional parties of capital, a man who had no funds, no millionaire backers, and yet he was elected in a situation where the U.S. was utterly shocked because it was out of their control now. Their ability to profiteer from the country with no limits. And now you had a man who becomes president in 1999, Hugo Chavez, saying, we're going to change everything. The resources will now belong to the people. We will use the wealth for our development, housing, healthcare, education, peace, equality, indigenous rights, all these things that came about. And therefore, it has been a war of 20 years by the U.S., an economic war. First, he was overthrown. Chavez was overthrown in his third year of presidency, that very year after he's brought back to office by the people who amassed around the presidential palace and demanded that the military give him back. Then that same year in the fall, a 5-month shutdown of the oil industry by U.S. and internal sabotage to try to destroy the economy and bring down the government. But they overcame it, the resistance. But these 20 years have been very difficult for the government. They have, however, continued with amazing programs of the housing, millions of houses built, free health care provided by Cuban doctors, the elimination of illiteracy by Cuban teachers. And the U.S. portrays the Cubans as military intelligence, but they're trying to portray it negatively in order to hide the real nature of the Cuban-Venezuelan relationship, which is solidarity. What does solidarity mean? It means supporting each other for the benefit of both peoples. Well, despite all this economic, aggression by the U.S. and the corporations inside Venezuela, because despite being a socialist government, the economy is primarily capitalist. It hasn't transformed yet. The objective of the government, this revolutionary government of first Chavez, now Maduro, is to build socialism. It's not completed yet, but the programs are socialist type of program in using the wealth as social investment, as they say, not social spending, not taxation, but investment. Now, because of the corporations in the country that control the importation and distribution of much of the food in the private markets, the government has instituted, as of 3 years ago, a program that you just asked about, CLAP, C-L-A-P as in Paul, all capital letters that stand in Spanish for committees, local committees of supply and production. It means creating a vast nationwide network of food self-sustenance. But at this point, I would still characterize it as sort of a war economy, meaning that the government is engaged in this sort of emergency yet long-standing program of providing food to 6 million households, which means probably about 20 plus million people. It's a country of 30 million. The wealthy don't have to worry. They have the money to buy food in the very, very high-priced private markets. The people, if they had to buy food in those markets, they wouldn't be able to eat. So the government for 3 years has had this program of a large box, I would say maybe 2 feet tall by 18 inches by 20 inches, something like that. Big box full of grains, dried goods, cooking oil, flour, all kinds of things for the family, plus chicken, eggs, beef, all of this to provide for a family per month costs to the family 2,800 bolivares. That's their currency, bolivar. 2,800. If you bought that same food in the market, private, it would be 117,000. 2,800 versus 117,000. So it's a government that's making sure people don't go hungry. And so it really just explodes the myth of the U.S. media that says people are starving to death. Wrong.
And that also kind of brings into the kind of point we've been at in the past few months with kind of first the self-declaration of a relative unknown in the country, Juan Guaido. At the time he declared himself "quote unquote" president, 81% of people in the country had never heard the name Juan Guaido before. So he essentially attempted to declare himself president. He was supposed to have held elections within 30 days, which would have expired either in late February or early March. I don't know the exact date. And kind of at that point, after his 30, quote unquote 30 days were up, all of which was again a farce to begin with, since he never held any sort of government power. When those 30 days were up, the Trump administration essentially attempted to ram through, with the help of kind of war criminals like Elliot Abrams, who were previously connected to the Iran-Contra affair. The exact same it's the exact same people who were part of these same insurgencies, these far right-wing insurgencies in the 1980s. So it's like the Trump administration is bringing these people in and attempting to ram through quote unquote humanitarian aid. The Venezuelan government turned it down, and you were actually a kind of a present for much of that. Can you kind of talk about what sort of the media mythology was versus the kind of reality on the ground?
Yes, you mentioned Juan Guaido. This is an unprecedented operation by the U.S. that unfolded publicly starting January 23rd this year, when Juan Guaido, this, as you said, unknown man, appears before the media having received the blessing of the United States. Mike Pence had called him the day before. He appears on media January 23rd and said, "I am the interim president." He falsely used an article that has nothing to do with his situation, what he claimed to be his right to declare himself president, even though he never ran. And Maduro is the president elected last May. But the U.S. has continued with this fiction in helping Guaido declare this parallel fake government, naming ambassadors who aren't even seated in offices except in Washington, D.C., that the U.S. has used this fiction to then say that they don't recognize President Nicolas Maduro, along with Canada and European governments and some right-wing Latin American governments. But anyway, the U.S. has used it to rob billions and billions of dollars of Venezuela's wealth, to supposedly give it to Guaido in this parallel government, but really what it is doing is keeping it in hold for the U.S. And therefore, Citgo, oil properties that are owned by Venezuela, has been seized by the U.S. in the United States. And those are billions of dollars that should be going to Venezuela to pay for food, housing, and medical care, but is now in U.S. banks. Now, with this fiction of Juan Guaido claiming that he was now the interim president, the same article in the Constitution that he falsely manipulated, but it also says that if he names himself interim president, or if there's an interim president named, not him, that was his case wasn't true, that interim president would have to have elections immediately in 30 days. Juan Guaido, 30 days after January 23rd is February 23rd. He had no power to hold elections because he's simply a puppet of the U.S. He has nothing in Venezuela. So what did he do? The U.S. has created diversion from this fiction. And they said, the people of Venezuela are starving, and therefore we're going to bring food into Venezuela through the bridges on the western end of the country bordering Colombia, because the U.S. has a government there, very right-wing, very repressive against its own people, Ivan Duque, who has lent himself to the service of the U.S. in this war against Venezuela. So there was a media show in the days before February 23rd for the supposed delivery of humanitarian aid. The Venezuelan, I was there. I took a 25-hour bus ride to the border with Colombia with a number of other people. There were hundreds of people, patriotic Venezuelans, who said, we're going to defend the border from this U.S. attempt to invade. They called it a Trojan horse. They said, we know what this is about. It's trying to weaken our resolve to defend our country. We don't accept it. Another official mentioned that although the U.S. claimed they were bringing 70 tons of food, the government of Venezuela provides 12,000 tons of food to that region on a monthly basis. 70 tons versus 12,000 tons. It was a show. It was a symbolic show.
And of course, as we established, the food shortage is not really the problem. It's not a shortage of food. It's the kind of private market.
Oh, yeah, there's plenty of food in the country. But as you said, the prices are too high in the private market. That's why the government has this whole delivery of food to people's homes at a subsidized price, at a very affordable price. But the other objective of this food delivery was that the U.S. wanted to see if they could break up the military of Venezuela and entice the soldiers and officers to come over to the U.S. side and therefore justify maybe a military invasion or attack, to try to have a military coup or to have a big enough force that was, serving the U.S. interests that it could justify further action. What happened? Trump, on television, addressing the Venezuelan army, said, you'd better come to our side. You have to do it right away. Come to our side or you will lose everything in your lives. That's exactly what he said. You will lose everything in your lives. Like, be a traitor to your country or you're going to regret it. And what happened on February 23rd? Some 300 soldiers from the National Guard, some from the Army, a handful of officers, but mostly, GI types. They crossed over into the Colombian border. They were enticed by a bribe from Narco Rubio. Some people call him Marco Rubio. I call him Narco.
For good reason.
Yeah. Narco Rubio had promised them. Now, he's a congressman from Florida. What role does he have? He's one of the henchmen of the Trump administration, who has long had this goal of trying to overthrow the Cuban Revolution and now the Venezuelan. So Rubio said, we will give each soldier who defects to the U.S. side $25,000. Well, those poor soldiers went across the border. They never got a penny. They were allowed some housing along with some of their family members, housing in hotels. But they've been evicted since then. They're living in the streets in Colombia, and they're being deported now back to Venezuela.
Wow.
That's what happens when you scab, betray your country, defect to the U.S. You're treated like dirt. You're spit out. And so that's an interesting tale. That's an interesting part of this show of the United States. But that failed because I was there at the border. There were 2 bridges that the Venezuelan people defended. I was their witness, reporting on what was going on, and I was at the Tienditas Bridge, which was on both sides. Entering the bridge, 200 meters away, the Bolivarian National Guard, that is of the government, was protecting us who were there near the bridge from terrorist groups that were trying to break through and pretend that they were getting aid from the U.S. In the other bridge, bordering Colombia, in the Colombian town of Cucuta and the San Antonio, the town of Venezuela, there was a very, very severe battle because these same terrorist groups financed by the U.S. were throwing Molotov cocktails at the soldiers, the Venezuelan soldiers, but they were defeated because the people held strong. And so that was one more plot of the U.S., this attempted so-called humanitarian food delivery that failed completely. What happens next? Guaidó says, he keeps calling dates for uprising, and they keep failing. The last major one was an attempted coup of some military, handfuls of military, on April 30th. That was a complete flop. And that at that point, some of these governments in Europe, Latin America, that have backed the fiction of Guaidó on behalf of the U.S. are now kind of retreating in their claim that they recognize Guaidó and saying, what is going on here? What trap did we fall into? And Guaidó, his support from the right wing, an opposition which has been historically fractured among each other, is trying to pick up their pieces and figure out, what do we do next? Because they cannot win against the people who support the revolution.
It's been interesting to see the fracturing of the Venezuelan opposition in the kind of recent couple years with regard to even what strategy they believe is most effective to implement their coup. You know, first you have kind of the 2017, what are called the guarimbas, the kind of flaming street barricades and the kind of street violence that took place under that. That for a while was sort of the strategy, and it aligns with what those of you who might be familiar with kind of other independent journalism would understand to be like a color revolution. The idea being that you take kind of whatever a legitimate grievance might be against the government and try and turn it into essentially a period of street violence that winds up in chaos that overthrows the government. But the thing is, that's already been tried in Venezuela. That happened in 2002. Venezuela was to my understanding, the only military coup. It's the only country where a military coup has happened that was reversed. I don't know of anywhere else that a military coup has actually gone the full way to oust a sitting president and then have that military then have to back down and reinstitute the president. Kind of since that point, the Venezuelan opposition has taken kind of more scattered approach in many ways. And of course, when I say the Venezuelan opposition, I'm talking about the kind of far right-wing parties of, for instance, the Popular Will Party of Leopoldo Lopez and Juan Guaidó. So, you know, they were essentially encouraged very heavily by Trump to boycott the election in 2018 because they knew they were going to fail miserably because who would vote for terrorists? And you know, if you look at the actual the May 2018 elections, I have looked
presidential.
Yeah, the presidential election. I have yet to see any real sort of evidence that it was rigged. If I ask people how did Maduro quote unquote rig the elections, they don't really have an explanation. As opposed to the kind of 150 international independent observers who was there in Venezuela, who were there specifically to audit the election system. All of these people were watching it. None of them, unanimously, what they said was that there was not voter tampering. No one in this independent election auditing found any evidence of voter tampering. And since then, since this boycott, even they wound up breaking their own boycott because Henry Falcón wound up running anyway, losing badly. And so with the complete, utter lack of confidence in Juan Guaidó, and at some point I'd like to talk about the class character of the military and why the military didn't follow Juan Guaidó, it seems to be just in complete chaos. The entire Venezuelan right-wing opposition just seems to be kind of in complete chaos. And you even see kind of a leaked audio, I believe, from Pompeo saying as much, that like he doesn't know even what to do with the opposition anymore.
Well, we have to look to understand what's going on with the election of May 20th, in which Nicolás Maduro was reelected for a 6-year term until 2025, which is what really bothers the U.S. It's not how he was elected, because he was elected fairly, a very clean process in Venezuela that has been, as you said, regarded by many who have viewed the last elections of the 20 years, that it's an incredibly stable and reliable election system, not subject to fraud, electronic or otherwise. But what really bothers the U.S. anywhere in Latin America and other parts of the world is an election of a leader or a government that doesn't bow down to its demands. And that's the case with Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro, that it reversed this pro-rich policy of decades. And so they decide we're not going to accept their elections. We see what the U.S. has done in interfering with pouring in millions of dollars to favor their candidate who will do their bidding, or we see military action, like the overthrow of the elected president Salvador Allende mentioned in Chile in 1973, or countless operations by the U.S. So the thing about Juan Guaidó and the opposition is, after all these failed attempts in which, for a time, when this aggression began this year in January with the naming of Juan Guaidó, the disparate elements of all these right-wing parties, not just Voluntad Popular, popular will, but also Justice First, Sumate, another group, several of them of which are really fascist, including Juan Guaidó's party, financed by the U.S., all these disparate elements who are always at each other's throats because they all want to be the president. They all want to lead the government. It's a matter of like, we want the booty. We want the booty involved in leading the country and just feeding like hogs at the trough to the riches, right? They all joined together behind Juan Guaidó because they thought this time, although we fought each other always, this time the U.S. is behind Juan Guaidó. This time the U.S. is going to make it happen. This time the U.S. will use its military and its power, its financial ability to sanction Venezuela and strangle it. And then we'll all benefit. But with the failure of Guaidó, they're starting to fight each other again. And that's why you said, it's true, that Mike Pompeo last week, in a meeting that he thought was secret with pro-Zionist leaders in New York City, he met with some people and was lamenting about perhaps the U.S. plan, for example, against Palestine, this great deal, this new deal with the Israelis was probably not going to pass. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, also said, oh, and by the way, this situation with the opposition in Venezuela, he's like, it's disastrously dismal situation. He says there's 40 of them. They all want to be president and they can't unite against Maduro. He says, we don't know what to do with him. And he even was describing Juan Guaidó as kind of like, maybe we can't stick with this guy. We got to figure something else out because he's a failure. And they're going to always fail because the majority of people in Venezuela know what it would mean if the rich came back in power. Not just to take back wealth from the people who've benefited from the sharing of the wealth, but the repression that would come forth if Maduro is overthrown. You're not just talking about replacing a man as president. You're talking about the forces that want to come in and crush the popular movements that have developed, the women's organizations, the military, which is backing this revolutionary ideal. I've met with many of those soldiers. I met many of the officers in different circumstances in my month stay in Venezuela. They're for socialism. The leaders of the military. It's an interesting phenomena. Sometimes people in the U.S., we're not used to that kind of thing. What does revolution mean? A revolution for the people. An attempt to build socialism.
Yeah, and I think really so much of Americans, especially kind of the American left and progressive-minded people, I think they project so many of the problems that they see, for instance, with our military, with our economy, onto Venezuela in ways where they don't understand, for instance, the role of the communes that really truly function. I mean, I guess you have kind of workers co-ops here, but they're not, to me, the same thing at all. So there's no kind of analogous structure that would be similar to, for instance, the communes. Or, for instance, if you a book I've been reading recently was Chavez, My First Life, where Chavez gets into sort of his history with like the Venezuelan military and sort of the real working class elements within that and the working class consciousness within that. Even before the Bolivarian Revolution, they still had somewhat of a kind of a Bolivarian tradition, and that's only been strengthened by Chavez. So like that character of the military is so different. And these kind of vast public housing programs are not just sort of administered from on high, for instance, but have, from my understanding, the kind of backing of these communes. To me, that is the strength of kind of a true socialist system versus a system that's just sort of a capitalist system with a welfare state. And I don't think Americans are really hearing about those sides of things that are the real kind of socialist social experiment that are, in fact, I think, working. Another one would be the Constituent Assembly. And yeah, I think that's a kind of vastly different thing than people normally see.
Well, you hit upon something interesting on the cynicism that people feel in the U.S. about government. There's two factors involved here in the misunderstanding of what's going on in Venezuela. Is that the U.S. people are used to seeing a government that's an antagonist to them. We all think of the government is against us, in many ways. The taxation, they don't do things for the people. You elect the officials and they just go on and do their own thing. They enrich the rich, and people have no confidence in the government. So you look at other governments as probably the same thing. I want to clarify a definition of a word that you mentioned. There's two words. There's the communes and the colectivo. Colectivo, the English word would be collective. But the word colectivo is being used in a very negative way in the U.S. press to say that the people are terrified of these groups, these gangs. They're described as gangs, colectivos. They wage terror on the population that doesn't agree with the Maduro government. And the colectivo can mean anything, a collective. But the word colectivo is used more in that country for these groups of people who have joined together, mostly in motorcycles. And so the colectivos that are being demonized in the media are actually a lot of men and women who ride motorcycles because that's their form of transportation, but who've joined together, whether it's because of geographical, they live in a neighborhood, or they have joined in clubs to defend people against right-wing attacks. There's been a great deal of violence since, especially 2013, of right-wing fascist gangs that have burned people, burned government buildings, burned government buildings that provide social services. And so these colectivos of motorcycle people, you'll see them appear suddenly in Caracas going by hundreds down the street with Venezuelan flags. They're showing we're a presence and we will defend the people peacefully. Example, a few weeks ago, there was a food distribution and a water because of the blackouts that happened for several days, electrical sabotage that shut down the electricity of the country in order to try to create discontent among the people. Well, I was there for the first one. The government was providing water in water trucks down one main street. People were gathering to get it in buckets and so on. And the right-wing gangs came out and started attacking people to break up the water distribution. And suddenly, within minutes, the colectivo of motorcycle riders came in to protect people and scare away the right wing. That's what they do.
Yeah.
But because they're defending the revolution, the U.S. media is trying to create an image of terror, and it's false. I saw them all the time. And the ones who complain about them are the elite.
From what I've seen, there's so much kind of documented evidence of truly kind of vicious right-wing attacks. I think that there was and it's always against targets that are associated with Chavismo, whether that's public housing, whether that's there was the firebombing. This is all taking place in the kind of 2017 street violence with which I'm most familiar. But there was the firebombing in 2017 of the maternity hospital. There were firebombings of warehouses full of food, and that's if you have a starving population, as the U.S. media is very insistent upon showing this narrative of a starving populations don't firebomb warehouses of food. People who want to create a crisis are people who firebomb warehouses of food. But I think the most vicious of these would be, or the kind of one that I think would be the most, in many ways, symbolic of what kind of right-wing violence we were talking about. And this is in 2017, a year before the 2018 presidential election. So we're understanding the political context in which the Popular Will Party is operating, would be the lynching of Orlando Figueroa, who was a black man who was burned in the streets of Caracas. And the people burning him, I believe, were shouting essentially, "See," in Spanish, like, "See, black man, this is what happens to Chavistas," was sort of the lynch mob's kind of cry as they were doing that. And that sort of thing never got reported. And that level of the kind of imparity of the violence and the terror really never got reported. And to the degree that things are, when they're reported from an angle of just assuming that all of the violence is wrought by the government, wrought by the Chavista government. And when you do see the corrections, when, for instance, the media it publishes so egregious a falsehood that it has to be corrected, it comes months later. For instance, that the quote unquote humanitarian aid that was trying to cross the border, the Trump, John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, who were so worried about humanitarian aid, as that tried to cross the border, much of that was burned too. But it was clearly burned. There were hundreds of observers there, and it was clearly burned by the right wing. That was reported as having been burned by the Venezuelan government, even though people were watching it. And just that degree, like, to me, it's always stunning, the openness with which, if you're looking closely at this sort of thing, if you follow the retractions that are made and you follow the independent media that, again, have the video evidence of this, and this happening, it's such a level of kind of corporate hubris on the part of the kind of corporate media to do that sort of thing, to just straight up lie.
I think the last few decades of U.S. aggression, whether it's Libya, Syria, Iraq, what they're doing against Iran, Venezuela, that the U.S. media has become more and more under the aegis of the Pentagon, of the CIA. It's like National Pentagon Radio, as one friend of mine has put it, because it's the same story. It's a universal portrayal, a false one, to justify U.S. action. The truth has to be the first victim, and it is. So if all the sources that people depend on, the New York Times, for example, they've been among the worst. They've been actually the worst, I think, in this false portrayal of Venezuela and the revolution. And so hundreds of newspapers in the U.S. reprint their articles because it's considered the newspaper of record. They've had horrendous articles. They're outright lies. How do people counter that? How do people see what to do? That's why when I was in Venezuela, I called my people. I said, we got to have a tour. I'm willing to go all over the country to speak. And so 41 cities, including last night in Houston, almost all of them have been very large audiences of people who are looking in the Facebook, looking in social media, looking in the newspapers for Venezuela. They're actually looking. And a lot of people who've come are not deeply involved in leftist politics. They're people who have, peace activists, or people who have doubts about what the U.S. is doing, not happy about the Trump administration. And all they can read about Venezuela is lies, but they're like, I can't trust this. I sense something wrong. So they're coming to the meeting to hear, what did you see? And I'm not the only journalist independent who has gone and come back with a similar story. The stores are packed with food, but the prices are too high. So the government brings the food to the families, to the neighbors. The other thing that you said about commune, that is a nationwide organization, a popular organization in the neighborhoods that is a way to resist the economic aggression and possible military action by the U.S. or paramilitary action by terrorists. And it's coupled with the development now of militias. There's civilian militias, very peaceful people, but who are prepared to defend their neighborhoods against attack. And they work side by side with the military. I saw many, many mobilizations of the civilian militia, 2.5 million people. And so now, to overcome any future electrical blackouts, to try to help bring the water that the government will provide on an emergency basis with water trucks, to help spread the news to the neighborhoods in case of a electricity blackout where you can't get news, you can't communicate by telephone, you have to go mouth to mouth, hand to hand, door to door to inform people. These communes are the people organized in defense of their country, and that's what they are, communes and communal council, that also help in the delivery of the food. It's the government and the people. It's not like, top-down direction, or it's not legitimate because it's not bottom up. I find that so absurd when some people describe it like, the government's doing this. I would like to have a government that was on my behalf. I would love to have a government that said, we're with the people.
And, again, as we were talking about, so much of that we just don't see within the U.S., that there's no sort of analogous concept for so much of kind of what we're talking about here. So I'd like to get into a little bit about the Constituent Assembly, how it came to be, and actually kind of rewind a little bit from the point of the Constituent Assembly to kind of the essentially deterioration of legitimacy of the National Assembly. I guess on the one hand, it speaks to sort of the fluidity of the kind of Venezuelan society with regard to their constitution in a way we don't see at all. We have this kind of constitution that's enshrined in stone. And then it also kind of speaks to what would likely happen if you look at sort of the deterioration of that National Assembly for the one election where they were essentially the capitalist parties were kind of voted back in, and what they sort of did to kind of wreck the country before they were declared essentially in contempt by the Supreme Court. It speaks to kind of the other forces at play, because I think so many people, again, want to sort of think that these revolutions happen in kind of a vacuum, that, if there's some kind of imperfection within the Venezuelan government or whatnot, that the quote unquote, the people just rise up and destroy it and start the whole thing and over again. And somehow that's going to create a perfect society. But in fact, with the balance of power here, in many ways, the PSUV continues to represent kind of the most progressive option. And if you were to have that kind of power vacuum, if the Trump administration's plan were to come to pass that would overthrow the Venezuelan government, the only other power that would be able to replace the PSUV would again be these capitalists who, Juan Guaido's, I think, first kind of proclamation, or one of his first, was to say that if he, because he again declared himself the president, that he said he was going to dismantle the housing program. And so, as we're talking about, like, this is the kind of forces here. But yeah, I'd like to, if we can talk a little bit about that kind of struggle, starting with maybe the 2015 elections where the kind of right-wing opposition won, what they sort of did to lose their legitimacy and essentially find themselves a now defunct body, and how that led to a Constituent Assembly that in so many ways has kind of galvanized the Venezuelan people around really feeling a part of a participatory government that they would never kind of see within a place like the United States. Like the chance of us having a Constituent Assembly at this point are pretty low.
Well, first, what is a Constituent Assembly? We're not familiar with that because, as you said, we have a constitution carved in stone of, I haven't calculated how many years old it is, but it is an ancient document that was written by slave owners. And The Constituent Assembly is a phenomenon that's quite common actually in other countries. And what it is a body of people from the population who are elected by popular vote to become delegates to an assembly, constituent assembly, that then rewrites a constitution for the country. We think that only one constitution can exist here because the powers that be, the capitalist powers, it serves their purposes quite well. And you can have a Supreme Court make all kinds of ruling against us. We know what they are. We're familiar with some of them. But in many countries, like after the end of apartheid in South Africa, they had a constituent assembly that rewrote the Constitution, reflecting one person, one vote. The Constituent Assembly in Venezuela in 1999, the very first year of Hugo Chavez's presidency 20 years ago, to show how bold he was as president, this Constituent Assembly that he called to be elected came together and wrote a new constitution that is still valid today. It's a very radical constitution that guaranteed that healthcare, education, housing would be free for the people. Indigenous rights, that the resources of the country belong to the people, a whole new document. It was made by a constituent assembly, and it was ratified for the first time in all the previous constitutions of Venezuela that the people voted on it too. That's what a constituent assembly is. And inspired by what Hugo Chavez had accomplished and the reduction of poverty and the improvement in people's lives that was so evident in Latin America in the 2000s, the first decade of this century, Evo Morales was elected then to Bolivia, and they had a constituent assembly and a new constitution. Rafael Correa was elected, a new constitution, progressive. And Daniel Ortega, they've all had the same process inspired by Venezuela. And the other thing that happened in Venezuela was that instead of a two-chamber Congress model after the United States, the senators who are more of an more exclusive club versus the deputies in the lower house, the two-chamber Congress was changed into a one-chamber, single National Assembly. That's the Parliament of Venezuela. And the 20 years of Chavismo, as we call it, the Bolivarian Revolution, has had 23 referenda. There's been elections for president, governors, mayor, and other such referenda, including for the Constitution. And most of them, 20 out of 23, have been favorable to the Bolivarian Revolution. And at different times in these elections, the U.S. has put its weight in either telling the opposition, we want to delegitimize these elections because they don't work for us. So different times, like for example, in 2005, they instructed the opposition, we can't win this. We can't win this parliamentary election, so boycott. So we can just say it's illegitimate and then we'll take action against it. They boycotted it, and what took place was a National Assembly that was pro-revolutionary, and they made a lot of gains. They passed laws that were helpful to the people, all kinds of laws to defend the revolution. And then the next time, or not the next time, but then in 2015, when the National Assembly was up again for re-election or for a new election of the National Assembly, the U.S. decided this time, we're going to throw our weight into this and we're going to support the opposition parties to run in the National Assembly. But in addition came an economic war that was going on for 2 to 3 years, ever since Maduro became president for the first time in 2013. And the U.S. engages in an economic aggression along with those corporations to hoard food, to make food disappear in the stores, to make things difficult for people, to help heighten the inflation. It's a whole economic aggression to make the population suffer through difficulty in obtaining food, toiletries, the kind of thing people depend on, and create discontent. When you have discontent in the population, often a certain section says, I'm not voting. You know, like we see here, I'm not going to vote this year. I'm boycotting. It doesn't represent me. That was what was happening in 2015, along with the U.S. putting money into these opposition parties to win. And they did win. In December 2015, the National Assembly, to the shock of many, including many of us observing these elections, we knew it would be close, but the election turned out as a supermajority for the right wing. It was like, wow, what does the government do now? Because it was still a leftist president, Maduro, a Supreme Court leftist, pro-socialist. What to do with a National Assembly that was going to start overturning all the progressive laws. And they did start. But in addition, some of the victories in the National Assembly by the opposition were under fraud, proven fraud. And they were instructed by the Supreme Court and the National Electoral Commission, which ruled some of these elections fraudulent. The Supreme Court ordered them to declare null and void some of those victories, and they refused. So the Supreme Court ruled the National Assembly that was dominated by the right wing as no longer legitimate, as null and void, as in violation of the Constitution. And that's why there's been this conflict where the U.S., having won that election with its influence and interference, found itself, what do we do? So this National Assembly, which was no longer able to carry out anything to overturn the progressive programs, there was a stalemate. But the violence continued, the violence in the streets by the right wing to try to destabilize the government and the population. So in May Day 2017, Nicolas Maduro, after a massive rally of tens of thousands of people, he speaks to the population and said, I have the constitutional prerogative as president to call a new constituent assembly, the one that can rewrite the Constitution. And the Constitution, if you read it, and if people really want to study Venezuela, you can get the Bolivarian Constitution of Venezuela of 1999, which is still in effect. You can read it in English on the internet. And he had the right, and he did, call for new elections of a new constituent assembly of the population with the aim of writing a new constitution, revising the current one, which is still very progressive. And it shook up Washington. They didn't expect it. They didn't expect this to happen. But the election was held that year, very interestingly. The Constituent Assembly was elected, and all of a sudden, the violence in the street stopped because the right wing was suddenly deflated. They had no way to fight this election of a new constituent assembly. And what happened in the population was people were relieved that the violence stopped. What was the violence like? It was burning metro stations, the subway stations. It was paralyzing. It was creating these huge barricades in neighborhoods where if you tried to go to work or cross it to go to the store, the right wing would kill you. And so people were terrified by this violence. So when this constituent assembly was elected, the violence stopped in the street. And it provided a lot of satisfaction in the population, which is why the next year, despite economic difficulties, because of the peace and this decisive move by Maduro, he was reelected by 67.8% of the vote. But the U.S. decided last year, this isn't going to continue. We're going to name a parallel government, which is why we are where we are today.
I was actually just able to speak to organizers in D.C. about, and as well as journalists in D.C. about the seizure of the Venezuelan embassy in the name of Carlos, the kind of fake ambassador Carlos Vecchio, and we talked at great length about first of all the huge violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and of course we also talked about the kind of international implications that has, and the fact that Vecchio himself cannot actually do anything, like essentially as the kind of ambassador within this empty building that he seized on behalf of the state, essentially thanking very heartily the U.S. State Department. He has no power to, for instance, issue visas. So you see the State Department intervening to have to say things like these visas are valid and whatnot. It's certainly it's a farcical situation, and it's been once again, as someone who does a lot of media criticism, it's been interesting to see the corporate media continue to use the terms like quote unquote embattled president, which is supposed to sound very neutral. Of course, there's this power struggle when in fact the coup that we've talked about has all but collapsed. I was actually skeptical at one point that Juan Guaido had actually convinced the Trump administration, because that was sort of the narrative I was hearing, that like Guaido convinced the Trump administration that he was the guy. They believed him and they backed him. I was thinking he was just essentially like their kind of sacrifice. Like it seemed for a little bit that he was worth more to them dead than alive, because if he was dead, they could use that as an excuse to do everything horrific that they intended to do. But no, it absolutely seems like this coup in many ways has collapsed, but the danger in so many ways continues. The kind of danger again of sanctions. The Center for Economic and Policy Research determined that 40,000 Venezuelans have been killed by the U.S. sanctions, and this is not Chavista funded or whatnot. This is a fairly neutral kind of center that's determined by kind of their calculations that as well as the UN rapporteur, as well as so many the United Nations itself, as well as other kind of these neutral arbiters that we believe to be kind of the enforcers of quote unquote rule of law, whatever that might mean. So many of these forces have just straight up said that the sanctions are causing deaths. Again, the Center for Economic and Policy Research put those deaths at 40,000 so far. And this is due to just the Trump administration refusing to live in the reality that the Venezuelan government is operational, that it is run by a socialist who is implementing, again, these kind of democratic reforms that really bring the people into a sort of political power and a sort of material stability that they did not ever have before the rise of Chavismo. That Chavismo itself continues as a revolution, and that the Trump administration, as much as they want to live in reality, as much as they want to deny reality, as much as they want to make the Venezuelan people suffer, they have lost this particular coup attempt. It seems to, for all intents and purposes, yet the kind of suffering continues, especially with the attacks on the power grid that we didn't really get a chance to mention. So in the last few minutes, if there's anything else you would like to kind of bring up, and otherwise, if you can just kind of talk about kind of where kind of things go from here, and what sort of does the role of the, not just the American left, but truly people within the U.S. who are concerned about this sort of thing, progressives and people who just generally believe themselves to have a conscience, who want to see an end to these kind of U.S. destructive wars. What is it that they kind of should be doing, and how is it they should be kind of getting involved at this point?
Yes, I'd like very much to mention also that it's not just Venezuela under attack in Latin America right now. John Bolton and the other officials of Trump have said outright that they plan to overthrow Cuba's socialism too, and overthrow the government of Nicaragua, which they have attempted plots before. In addition to Venezuela, it's quite a serious, brazen claim by the U.S., but they've tried to do that for 60 years against Cuba. They've thrown everything they can: invasion, plans for bigger invasion, biological warfare, terrorism has killed thousands of Cubans, and the biggest terror of all is the U.S. blockade of Cuba. But now they have intensified that blockade against Cuba and Venezuela by sanctioning the ships that deliver the oil vast amounts of oil to Cuba from Venezuela. In exchange, Cuba has 24,000 doctors and teachers in Venezuela. It's a fair economic arrangement. But to block Venezuela's oil from Cuba is really an act of war, in addition to these other acts of war called sanctions. And so we have to keep in mind that Cuba is under attack too. And I believe that the solidarity with Venezuela must extend to Cuba, must extend to Nicaragua, and any other country in the world. Look at Iran. Iran is sanctioned as well, North Korea. Countries that do not bow down to the dictates of Washington. And yet I think that the solidarity that's growing between countries, of China and Russia delivering the medicine that the U.S. is attempting to block to Venezuela, the countries, certain governments in the world that are saying, we will help you, and the governments that say respect their sovereignty, their independence, Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, China, Russia, others that are saying that it's a dangerous world if the U.S. continues marching on with its armies. Not really armies, bombs, the sanctions. The U.S. has enormous economic, military, and financial power, but I believe the people ultimately have more power. And the resistance that I saw in Venezuela was remarkable, that despite all the hardship, they've gained so much more and are willing to defend it with their lives. We don't want that to happen. But the U.S., I saw personally in 3 visits to Iraq during the 12 years of the U.S. sanctions, a euphemism for genocide against Iraq. They bombed the country to smithereens for 43 days in 1991, destroyed all the civilian infrastructure of water, electricity, and food, and then for 12 years they blockaded that country completely. But the resistance continued. And yet the U.S. was determined they would have that oil and this geostrategic political control in the Middle East, first against Iraq and then other countries like Iran. And after 12 years of the Iraqi resistance, the U.S. found a pretext after 9/11 to obliterate Iraq, to carve it up. They want to do that with Venezuela. They're attempting it against Syria. We're living in a world of great U.S. military danger. And so with the U.S. media lies, with the politicians in Congress refusing to stand up to the Pentagon, Democrats and Republicans supporting this U.S. aggression in Latin America, we, the people, it's up to us. And I'm calling on the readers, the listeners actually, to follow a guideline of a lot of progressive media that we have put together, a list that's available on answercoalition.org. Again, answercoalition.org, which stands for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. Scroll down a little bit and look up Progressive Media List. There's a real wealth of primary source material that you can read what is really going on daily in Venezuela. The resistance is going to continue.
So we have been joined for the full hour of this episode by Gloria La Riva, who was the 2016 presidential candidate for the Party for Socialism and Liberation, as well as a longtime journalist, political activist, and organizer of various stripes, and the coordinator for the Cuba-Venezuela Solidarity Committee. Thank you very much, Gloria, for coming back on the show today.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate, again, the invitation to be here. Always
glad to have you on. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brian Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP Austin and is also available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.